Welcome everyone to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show, brought to you by the GoldSilverBitcoin.com store. We are more than honored to be sitting down today with Josh Sidman. He is the international coordinator of the Silvio Gesell Institute. Thank you so much, Josh, for joining us today.
Thanks, Justin. Appreciate you having me.
And the institute is based in Argentina. Can you tell us about Silvio Gesell's economic philosophy?
Sure. Well, Silvio Gesell was a German economist and entrepreneur. He lived from 1862 to 1930. And he, through his experiences as a businessman, he came to an understanding of wealth and money and markets that, in my opinion, is unrivaled by any academic economist. He didn't even have a university education, and in a sense, I think that allowed him to see things with a more open perspective, perhaps, than someone who has been trained in the field of economics. And I would attribute some of his insights to the fact that he was entirely self-taught in the field of economics. His philosophy basically boils down to two problems that he saw in the free market system. He felt that at the time, the existing system of money, which at that time was the gold standard, was a flawed form of a medium of exchange. And we can get into the specifics of why he saw it that way. So he thought that money needed to be fundamentally reformed in order to properly perform its function as a medium of exchange. And he also thought that private ownership of land was antithetical to the basic principles of free markets. He's a fairly misunderstood character in my experience. Those who do know of him tend to group him in with Karl Marx, with socialists, with communists, when in my opinion, he is perhaps the truest exponent of free markets that I know of. But in general, he's completely unknown to most people. I had never heard of him until I was in my mid-30s. I had already done a degree in economics. I had already worked on Wall Street and had never heard his name. And I came across him reading Keynes. Keynes spent 5 pages in the General Theory talking about Silvio Gesell. And to me, that was an extraordinary thing, that probably the most influential economics book of the 20th century spent 5 pages talking about someone who I had never heard of, and whose philosophy spoke to me in a way that no other economist ever had before. And I was curious why I had never heard of this guy before. So that began a 15-year process now of learning, of networking, and now of being a representative of his economic philosophy.
So private property is pretty fundamental in our general understanding of free markets today. It's a fundamental basis of those markets. So can you explain why Gesell thought it was antithetical to a free market, that is the ownership of private land?
Absolutely. I would say the most fundamental principle of free markets is that people should be allowed to keep and enjoy the fruits of their labor. However, land existed prior to man, and therefore land cannot be viewed as the fruit of anyone's labor. Therefore, if human labor is the basis for private property, then there's no way that land can become private property according to that principle. So Silvio Gesell, like I said, is, in my opinion, a pure free market economist. However, he recognized that ownership of land is of a fundamentally different nature from any other kind of private property. So, it's an issue. It's a very challenging issue to talk about, because anyone who hears that principle immediately jumps to the conclusion that we're talking about communism, which is absolutely not the case. Like I said, in my view, it is the opposite of communism. It is a recipe for the perfection of the free market system.
When we think that something is not owned privately, then it's generally owned publicly in a public setting, and the steward of the public assets is generally the state. So did Silvio Gesell believe that the state should ultimately have, I guess, maintain order in terms of land, I suppose?
Yes, he believed that land should be owned by the state, and that land use should be determined by a system of competitive bidding for leases.
Okay, so now what we see time and time again in the state is that it's often taken over by plutocrats, by cartels of the often this day and age of the corporate variety, who essentially through special interests and otherwise mismanage public assets, oftentimes siphoning them off for themselves. Now, did Gesell acknowledge that problem?
Yeah, for sure. And I am as skeptical of corrupt centralized power as anyone. So I recognize that the idea of making the government our landlords essentially is one that that people who have become very skeptical of government are going to have a very hard time accepting. I would say that the countervailing consideration is that by implementing this system of land use, you could do away with a lot of what government currently oversees. For example, if government owned all of our land and was our landlord, that would represent an enormous source of public revenue that, in my opinion, this is, to be clear, with this statement, I'm not necessarily representing Gesell's thought exactly. This is my thought. That source of revenue could replace all existing forms of taxation. So certainly it's challenging to accept the idea of government being given control of all land, but it would also, on the other side of the coin, it would allow us to take away a lot of what government currently oversees and controls. So I think net it would not represent an increase in government's role in our lives in the big picture.
In a way, we kind of already exist on this sort of like leasing system because of property taxes. So if you don't pay your property taxes on your property, your home will be taken away from you. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah. Are you familiar with Henry George, who was a land reformer and single taxer in the middle of the 19th century? He spoke about the same issue. He felt that private ownership of land was the primary cause of poverty, of wealth inequality, of economic instability. And his solution was to tax away all land value. Gesell felt that taxation was not the correct solution to the problem of private land ownership because taxation can be passed on to those who are using the land and therefore would not necessarily take the unearned wealth away from landowners. It would just be passed on to all of the activities that land is used for, and leaving the power and wealth inherent in land ownership in place and intact.
So it says here regarding Gesell's view of establishing welfare systems, he does not believe it is effective to establish welfare systems without abolishing private ownership of land, because the proceeds of the labor of workers are determined by the proceeds of labor that they can obtain on free land. The benefits gained by the welfare system are not to increase the proceeds of labor that workers can obtain on free land, but rather to increase the proceeds of labor that they can obtain on the lands of landowners. Private ownership of land converts all the advantages of using one's land into cash, and it belongs to the landowner. In order not to cancel the effects of welfare policies, Silvio Gesell's free land reform is therefore needed. Do you have any further comments on his view of, I guess, free land or also the welfare?
Not anything other than to reiterate that Silvio Gesell believed in competition, believed in private property, believed in free markets, believed that that the Marxist solution, for example, is counter to human nature, which I would assume that you would probably agree with. Gesell came out of basically the same time and place as Karl Marx. They were both Germans. Gesell was a couple of decades later than Marx, but they were both struck by the same thing. They were both living in, the first real century of seeing what the industrial free market system did in practice, and comparing that with the theory, the classical theory of the invisible hand, of a system which lifts all boats together. And they looked around them and saw that the practice did not match the theory. And they both asked themselves, why? And they both came to really opposite conclusions about why. Karl Marx concluded that private ownership of the means of production automatically produces economic injustice, and that therefore the solution is to do away with free markets, with private property. Gesell looked at the same situation and recognized that our system of money and our system of land ownership represented flawed implementation of free market principles. And he believed that if those two problems were fixed, then the free market system would, in fact, deliver on what the classical school of economics believed the free market system was capable of generating.
When I think about competition, so I imagine this really at even at the level of a superstructure of a society, to borrow a Stalinist term. So that is, in other words, that the state itself would face competition, making it therefore voluntary. So does that make sense to you?
I'm not clear what you're saying.
Yeah. So people could, in other words, opt out of the state, and that the state would face competition. So if there was an institution that managed the money better, then that entity would ultimately win out market share over the, a competing state, if you will. Or another example, when it comes to stewarding the land, if there were competing states and a state was managing land better, then people might move to that geographic region due to that reason, forcing a competing institution or state to perhaps reform its policies. So now when it comes to free market, I see it really at that base layer, there has to be competition. So like in the Gesell model, is it, does the state face any competition? Or is it just always that this sort of this entity kind of is eternal?
I'm not sure what competition the state could face. I mean, Gesell was, and I use this term cautiously because I know that it has connotations, but he was essentially in favor of a unified global economy. He did not believe in national borders. He believed in free trade. He believed in free movement. So his ideal situation would have been this is the dangerous term, a world government that provided a universal medium of exchange that was used everywhere.
The issue then therein lies if that medium exchange is inefficient or mismanaged, then there's all sorts of mispricings in the overall economy, which creates all sorts of distortions. And that then there is no competition, and the people of the world would have no alternative to turn to ultimately. And then when you have centralized power at that level, and also people living on different continents as they do, it becomes much easier for them to have a say in the matters of this government. So I think that now, while I also advocate for a world economy, a free trade between entities, I see this being much more efficient and at a level of decentralization. And I don't mean efficient in terms of economic or technological process, but rather in the sort of intangibles that I think we should all strive for more, starting with a basis in ethics and morals, and then the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and love. And I think that is achieved much more efficiently at a local level. So I believe that, like, we could have a city, say San Diego, California, which is managing it's the state. There's a state there managing San Diego, if you will, but its jurisdiction ends in San Diego, and it can have voluntary associations with other quote unquote states like Los Angeles, for instance. But generally speaking, a resident could move from San Diego, where say it's a conservative military or sort of let's just say conservative population, to Oakland, California, and there's really no bonds. There's no federal state. It's just a separate, complete and separate other state. And so now also, though, I would take that further and say the way in which I see this playing out most efficiently is essentially via private entities that are doing this, that are kept local so that they cannot gain too much power. And it's essentially voluntary. Everything's voluntary, so you can opt out. One of the biggest issues, and I think what makes a society, socialist or otherwise, is not being able to opt out. When you're born into this world, you're given a social security number, and you can't opt out of that. There's no way to get out of that. In fact, the hospitals are paid very much money to ensure that that's one of the very first things that you do through Medicaid and Medicare, et cetera. These other bribery programs, which is essentially how I view them. Welfare isn't necessarily to improve the plight of poor people in the working class, but rather to bribe them into allowing the state to ultimately commit atrocities. And we see this in totalitarian societies historically, like in Nazi Germany, for instance. There was the I guess, joy through travel program. I forget what it was called exactly. And they were essentially allowed to go on vacations and go on cruises paid for by the Nazi state. And perhaps that was the bribery for keeping your mouth shut for what would come in the years to come. Now, to kind of bring this back in, Now, that's the main issue at the state. So we have a steward of public lands, and there's no competition. It's just as eternal as the rivers flowing themselves. That's already like the absence of free market, I think, is what like I will say, I won't use capitalist because like a free enterprise mind might argue today. Any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts. Just trying to think of which one to start with. Well, first of all, I'll explain that I spent 14 of the last 15 years thinking about these ideas in isolation. I could not connect with anyone else out there who was aware of or interested in Silvio Gesell. The ideas spoke to me, and I would write about them. I would talk about them with anyone who would listen or read to, what I had to say. But I was not finding anyone else out there who was really interested or receptive. In the past year, I became connected with this organization based in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And so for those 14 years, I was asking myself, all right, these ideas make sense to me, but I don't see any conceivable path toward implementation. How could you ever convince people to give up private ownership of land? How could you ever convince central monetary authorities to fundamentally change the nature of money, which is a subject that we haven't even started to talk about, and we need to. And so for me, it was a purely academic interest until about a year ago. And then I connected with this organization in Argentina, and they are pursuing a model of local community-oriented initiatives, which are based on Gesellian principles. And that opened my mind to a path forward and made it much more concrete and something that I can imagine making headway with, rather than a pie in the sky idea that has no realistic chance of ever being realized. So my current orientation is exactly what you just said, which is toward the creation of a local community-based model that would essentially be creating an alternative economic system on a local basis, implementing these two fundamental reforms, which is non-hoardable currency and community-owned land, and seeing how it works on a local level, because I believe that the results would be superior and that the results would be far more powerful than any theoretical argument that one can make. Talking about this stuff only gets you so far. But if you can implement the principles and improve people's lives by doing so, then you're in a whole different ballpark. And that is where my energies and efforts are based at this point, is developing a model for a local implementation of these ideas and allowing them to prove or not prove their superiority.
And I think that's one of the strengths of free market and diversity, is that anyone's whims could theoretically be implemented in a even small geographic area. And if it is utopia, you're going to have a lot of people wanting to implement those same ideas elsewhere. Now, let's move on down, because I think that we've kind of spoken about the land quite a bit, and there are some other interesting ideas that I think give a more rounded view of Gesell's ideas. So, for instance, Gesell based his economic thought on the self-interest of individuals, which he saw as a natural and healthy motive in satisfying their needs and being productive. Gesell believed that an economic system must do justice to individual proclivities. Otherwise, the system would fail. He believed that this stance put him in opposition to Marxism, which Gesell considered proposed an economic system that was against human nature. Believing that the talent and selfishness of individuals must be taken into account, Gesell called for free, fair business competition with equal chances for all. This included the removal of all legal and inherited privilege. Everyone should rely only on their abilities to make a living. In the natural economic order, which Gesell recommended, the most talented people would have the greatest income, without distortion by interest and rent charges. The economic status of the less talented would improve because they would not be forced to pay interest and rent charges. According to Gesell, this would result in less difference between the rich and the poor. Furthermore, greater average incomes would mean that the poor would have a greater chance of escaping poverty, in part because other poor people would have a greater disposable income and spending power, therefore. So do you have any comments on that? So I'm also, I guess we can also, well, do you have any comments on that in general? For instance, Gesell calling for a free, fair business competition.
Well, I think this conversation actually has gone in the opposite direction from how I anticipated. Normally, I end up spending a lot more time talking about his analysis of money, and the land issue is kind of secondary. We started off with the land, and now I think we should move on to the money, especially given your focus being, hard assets and Bitcoin. That Gesell's analysis of money has a lot to say about that. So let's talk about money from basic principles. It's pretty universally agreed upon that money has three primary functions, right? The first function is as a medium of exchange. The second function is as a unit of account. And the third function is a store of wealth. Gesell recognized that the medium of exchange function of money and the store of wealth function of money essentially conflict. And he believed that it is not possible for one instrument to effectively serve both purposes, and that by combining our medium of exchange with a store of wealth, we ended up creating a fundamentally flawed medium of exchange, which fails to circulate properly. And he attributed poverty, unemployment, economic instability, economic crises to this inherent flaw in the nature of money. And he believed that in order to fix all of those problems, we need to separate the two primary functions of money. We need to have one instrument, which is a pure medium of exchange, which cannot be used as a store of wealth. And his proposed solution for accomplishing that is known as demurrage currency. Demurrage currency is money that is deliberately designed to lose value, to lose purchasing power at a predetermined and consistent rate. He proposed 5%, that money should lose purchasing power at a rate of 5%, and therefore it would not be usable as a store of wealth. No one would try to use money as a way to store wealth. They would have to find other ways to store wealth. And by separating those two functions of money, we would be left with a medium of exchange which would circulate more rapidly, more consistently, and result in a more equitable distribution of wealth throughout society, as well as a more stable economic system.
Can you speak more to that, perhaps? Are there any, and then also perhaps how people might store wealth in a system in which, so their money devalues over time, and then also they're not really able to own land. How can they store wealth in a Gesellian society?
Anything other than land or money: gold, silver, agricultural products, oil. One of the core observations of the Gesellian worldview is based on the nature of matter. Physical goods and services lose value with the passage of time. That is just the nature of the universe. That's something that we cannot do anything about. If you produce physical goods and services, you are under pressure to get rid of your products sooner rather than later, because virtually any form of real assets lose value with the passage of time. And the problem is that by using a medium of exchange which does not lose value with the passage of time, we create a fundamental imbalance between real goods and services and the medium of exchange that is used to transact in real goods and services. And we inadvertently create a privileged position of power for holders of money vis-a-vis producers of real goods and services.
In China, we've seen experimentations with a money that it's a central bank digital currency, which ultimately is burned or which goes away actually after a certain amount of time. So if you don't spend it, you lose the credits that are in your digital wallet. Would you say that this is a modern day implementation of Gesellian ideas or not?
It's related, but it's of a whole different magnitude. Again, Gesell proposed a demurrage rate of 5%. That's not a rapid rate of depreciation. And I think that what the Chinese are experimenting with would involve a much more rapid rate of depreciation and really changes the nature of how it would operate. There was a famous implementation of demurrage currency during the Great Depression in a town in Austria called Würgel. This was a town with a population of around 4,000 or 5,000 people that was hit very hard by the Great Depression. It was experiencing extreme unemployment. And the mayor of the town was aware of Silvio Gesell and his proposals. And he convinced the town to implement a demurrage currency. In 1933, this town took 40,000 Austrian shillings, deposited them in a bank, and used them as backing for a local demurrage currency. And then they used this demurrage currency to pay government employees, and they also made taxes payable in this demurrage currency. And the experiment worked almost overnight, exactly as Gesell imagined it would. The economy of the town quickly gained steam, jobs were created, tax revenue increased, this episode is referred to as the miracle of Würgel. In a span of 13 months, which is how long this experiment lasted before the Austrian central bank ultimately shut it down, this tiny town of 4,000 people attracted the attention of the world because of what they accomplished via a demurrage currency. 170 other municipalities sent representatives to Würgel to hear the mayor talk about their experiences, and with an eye toward implementing the same principles in their towns. Irving Fisher, who was one of the most famous American economists of the time, sent a representative to Würgel to study this system. And he wrote his own book called Stamp Script, which was essentially introducing the concept of demurrage currency to an American audience, because he viewed it as a potential solution to the Great Depression.
I pulled up an article by NPR here, and it writes a little bit about his view of money. It's from an excerpt of Planet Money's newsletter. And Gesell said, or rather the article writes, Gesell wanted to create a new kind of money, a money that would rot like potatoes and rust like iron, so no one would want to hoard it, a money that was an instrument of exchange and nothing else. Through a series of pamphlets, articles, and books, Gesell inspired a worldwide movement that introduced a completely new form of money. It is one of the most fascinating and largely forgotten stories in economic history. But after 70 years of obscurity, Gesell is making a comeback. All of a sudden, this obscure radical from another age has his name and ideas popping up in unlikely places, like speeches of leaders at the U.S. Federal Reserve, research papers of the IMF, and the pages of the Financial Times. As the industrialized world grapples with stagnation, and as markets signal another recession, policymakers are struggling to figure out what to do. Could Gesell provide an answer? So you believe Gesell could provide an answer. Can you elaborate a little bit about that as well as to build on what you've already said?
Yeah, so Gesell's analysis of money is, as I said, based on what he saw as a conflict between its two primary functions. We've already talked about that a little bit. We now need to talk about how does that conflict manifest into all of the economic dysfunction that we witness in economies around the world. And the phenomenon that hoardable currency gives rise to is interest. And Gesell would, I think, refer to interest essentially as a cancer of the economic system. Interest is a result, well, this is my opinion. There are competing schools of thought as to why interest exists. And it's a very important question that I think most people have probably never thought about. Why does the fact that someone has a sum of money entitle that person to receive more money without any additional effort? And there are probably four different widely subscribed to theories as to why interest exists. The classical and Austrian schools attribute interest to what they call time preference. There is also the productivity theory that by that money allows entrepreneurs to achieve greater productivity, and therefore money should be entitled to share in the fruits of that productivity. Gesell believed that interest was an unintended consequence of an improperly formed, an improperly conceived form of money, and that it resulted in massive misallocation of wealth throughout society, and that a properly conceived medium of exchange would not give rise to interest, and therefore it would circulate in a fundamentally different way, and it would distribute wealth in a different way, and he saw interest as being the fundamental cause behind poverty, wealth inequality, economic instability.
What else do people need to know about Gesell before we kind of head into, so like, for instance, in the modern context, how could Gesell help some of the problems we're in before we get into a discussion about what he might think about Bitcoin?
It's really that simple. Gesell had two and, well, one might say three proposals, but I boil them down to two. One is the land issue, the other is demurrage currency, and then the other is a world currency. But I see 2 and 3 as essentially being the same. So, I often say that Gesell's entire economic philosophy could be written on the back of a napkin, and that's what makes it so compelling. Is that it's simple. It's straightforward. It's something that you don't need a degree in economics to understand. And I think that the language in which economics is normally spoken about is very harmful, because it alienates, it excludes 98% of people from the conversation. I'm sure that you've experienced this, that most people turn away from economics because they can't make sense of it. And I think that's very harmful. I think that everyone needs to understand, think about, and involve themselves in their own economic future. And Gesell speaks about economics in a way that is accessible to anyone without having to go and get any specialized training or credentials.
What might Gesell think of Bitcoin, for instance? So for one, it is a worldwide currency. It is the opposite of a demurrage currency. And what do you think he would think of it?
I think Gesell would say that Bitcoin has its priorities exactly backwards. Bitcoin is designed as a store of wealth. And therefore, I believe he would say it cannot function effectively as a medium of exchange. The fact that it is what I think you and most Bitcoin aficionados would describe as its greatest strength, which is its strictly limited supply, is exactly the reason why Gesell would say that it cannot replace conventional currency, because Bitcoin is designed to be hoarded, and therefore it will not circulate in the way that the world needs a medium of exchange to circulate. So I am not anti-Bitcoin and I am not anti-crypto, but I think that Bitcoin itself will never become a replacement for conventional currency. I think it is very possible, in fact, likely, that future forms of decentralized cryptocurrencies will and should replace our existing forms of money. But I don't think it will be Bitcoin, for the reason that Bitcoin's supply cannot accommodate the needs of commerce.
Well, you might say that a demurrage currency is made possible in a world where there is Bitcoin, because if people can't store their wealth in their native money or currency, then an option like Bitcoin, which is essentially the opposite of such an idea, would fit the bill. What do you think about that?
I wouldn't disagree with that. I think it's important to always keep in mind the delineation between the two functions of money, between a medium of exchange and a store of wealth. If Bitcoin was viewed exclusively as a store of wealth and not as a medium of exchange, then I think absolutely it has a legitimate function and purpose. What concerns me is, for example, as I'm sure you're aware of, the situation in El Salvador and the fact that they have chosen to make Bitcoin legal tender. To me, that is pure insanity. I would bet my life that it will not work, that it will do grave harm to the people of El Salvador, and that it will ultimately be abandoned, because it's my belief that Bitcoin is formulated in such a way that it can never function as a medium of exchange, which is what legal tender needs to be. So if you were to say to me, Bitcoin is the ultimate store of wealth, and that's where it stops and starts, I would be with you 100%. But when people start imagining that it can be used as money And money is a very tricky word because it contains these two functions, which, in my opinion, are fundamentally incompatible. The word money itself, maybe we shouldn't even use it anymore. Maybe we should start using medium of exchange and store of wealth as two separate words, so that we're not using a word that contains an inherent contradiction.
In the El Salvador setting, might it, because there are now two official currencies, two legal tenders, one being Bitcoin, one being dollar, actually perhaps be an implementation in a way of demurrage currency? Because you have the US dollar, which is it being inflated currently, and it is, I mean, I'm not going to, it's even losing a little bit of value. Therefore, it is perhaps by nature a demurrage currency. And then they also have the second option, which is Bitcoin. And it might play out such where you have a situation where Gresham's law, I believe it's called, essentially dictates that people spend dollars and they hold their Bitcoins. And because they at least have some velocity of Bitcoin in the country, people are able to get their hands on it. Do you see that perhaps being a boon to El Salvador?
That makes sense on the Bitcoin side of the equation. I do not see the US dollar as being an effective medium of exchange either. And that highlights an important distinction that I want to mention, which is most people, when they first hear the concept of demurrage, they think inflation. They see the two things as equivalent, and they are not equivalent at all. The reason why inflation and demurrage are not the same thing is because demurrage is consistent and predictable. It is the same at all times. Inflation is unpredictable and inconsistent, and it is when prices start falling that our medium of exchange stops circulating. So while it is true that over any long period of time, the US dollar is an inflationary currency, that is not true at individual points in time. There are many times when the US dollar is not inflationary and may in fact become deflationary. And it is at those specific times when it fails to function as a medium of exchange. Gesell said that with hoardable currency, commerce is mathematically impossible with falling prices. What he means by that is when prices start to fall, or even when there is just an expectation of falling prices, that holders of hoardable currency have an incentive to postpone their purchases as much as possible. Because if you can buy something cheaper tomorrow, then you're going to choose not to spend your money today. And this is something that plays out over and over throughout history, throughout systems of hoardable currency, whether we're talking about the gold standard or whether we're talking about fiat currency. They are both hoardable in deflationary environments, and therefore they both stop circulating at exactly the times when society needs them to circulate. So to go back to your question, yes, I believe that in a place like El Salvador, Bitcoin could be half of the monetary puzzle, but the US dollar is not the appropriate other half. If they implemented a national demurrage currency alongside Bitcoin, then they might actually have something that could serve the needs of their society. But Bitcoin paired with the US dollar is two forms of hoardable currency, and leaves them without an effective medium of exchange.
Josh, where can people find you?
We're on all of the major social media platforms: Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. On Facebook, it's the Silvio Gesell Institute. On YouTube as well, the Silvio Gesell Institute. On Twitter, it's at the Silvio Gesell. I also moderate a Reddit sub, which is Silvio Gesell, and I also have my own Substack, which is Substack, joshsidman.substack.com.
Thank you so much, Josh, for joining us today, and thank you everyone for listening.